Hey guys, I kind of have a fun video for here today, just to kind of recap what has happened in New World so far and to kind of show how far New World has come. And I wanted to do the top 10 most broken builds of all time, including exploits. Basically everything goes in this case at any point in time in New World history, and from this you can kind of get an idea of like how much more balanced New World actually is in its current state compared to some of the past states. As much as people like to complain, the game has improved a very significant amount. It did take a decent long time to get here, but now that we're kind of like in a spot where the game is like relatively balanced from a PvP perspective, it's kind of fun to reflect on it. So hopping into the list, number 10 on my top 10 most OP builds of all time given any patch was the kind of original SNS Blunderbuss combo when Blunderbuss came out. The SNS Blunderbuss as a combo itself wasn't actually a thing when Blunderbuss first came out, because Blunderbuss itself was so OP that it was able to basically one-shot people just from an auto into a Zoth Shrapnel Blast. And I should have a clip that's playing here, but it was very, very strong. SNSBB, what this did is it put people into a get-outable kind of CC effect into the Azlaw Shrapnel Blast. This build was kind of indirectly balanced by if other people were to hit the target that you were hitting, they would instantly be woken up, quote unquote, from the CC effect, and they were able to get out of it. It was also counterable if you ran large amounts of freedom. That being said, that was typically not possible to be run for certain builds at the time. Like a healer can't run large amounts of freedom, and I believe you needed to hit 4 to 5 freedom at the time for this to not be preventable. So this build was very, very strong, but is nowhere near some of the builds that are on like later on in this list. But I think it definitely makes the top 10. Number 9, I have the OG Greatsword Deto combo. So this is kind of like a more recent one that has been nerfed, both Greatsword and the Detonate. At the time when this first came out, I don't think people realized how OP this is, but in hindsight, and by the time people figured out this was OP, it was patched within probably a month worth of time, which from a New World standpoint is pretty good. But the base idea here was Greatsword, when you go into Onslaught stance, you have a guaranteed crit. This crit from the actual detonate ignored Rezel for some reason, which is why they made it so that critting with a from detonate itself was no longer possible as they're fixed. So the critting will still ignore Rezel probably on cannon and stuff like that. I just haven't played around with it because I'm not super into using the cannon ultimate, nor really want to farm it to test. But that's the base idea from the detonate side. Why it was super strong. You go into onslaught, you got that guaranteed crit, and then on top of this, the root at the time was an old root, and the old roots you cannot dodge when it was happening. So if you got rooted from an old root, like very early on in the game, you couldn't dodge, which enabled some combos that we'll get into later on in this risk that were very broken at the time. But this allowed Greatsword to basically turn into an AoE nuker class, a lot alongside of having the absurd like overpowerness that Greatsword originally had in terms of lunging super far. You can get away with like kind of absurd splits. Greatsword is like the main reason why the 150 dex had to be changed to be 300 dex, I think, because it's the main build that kind of gets to that threshold, and then you could use one of like many offhands with it and find great success, and this combo is what enabled that. Moving on to number 8, OG Great Axe plus Brazil. Honorable mention here, Great Axe Ice Gauntlet, that kind of came about later on. The Ice Gauntlet I'll kind of get into in a second and later on in this list and explain why. But OG Great Axe was just super strong because the lunge on it was about 5 meters in terms of hitting people. The original meta when the game first came out was 45 Great Axe Warhammers and 5 AoE healers for a reason. It was just absurdly overtuned. I think part of the reason this was happening, to be honest, was that one of the dev leads happened to be a Great Axe Warhammer player, and I don't think he wanted to nerf his class because he was having so much fun with it, but it was not very balanced whatsoever. The other thing on here where I mentioned Rezel used to be flat damage mitigation, so it would mitigate 5% of the damage that you took, and that would be your damage reduction. This is different from the current version of Rezel, where you have to crit, and then the Rezel will reduce the damage of the crit, but it won't reduce the damage itself. So the current version of Rezel is much more balanced. I would argue that it's not even super strong anymore, but the original version of Rezel was super strong, a must-have, and it enabled OG Great Axe to just get so much value, and at the time, it was the only thing that was runnable. That being said, there were things that were discovered later on that I think would have made this build obsolete, even if we were to revert back to that patch if we had some of the other builds on this list. So moving on to number 7, this is where I have Icespike and OG Ultimate Chill. So this is kind of like high on the list for having that build, but we're going to get crazy here in terms of exploits in a second. But Ultimate Chill, the reason why this was hard meta for the longest time was the Ultimate Chill effect applied to everyone else, not just your effects. So basically every Ice Gauntlet was running Ultimate Chill to increase the damage of bruisers per se, because it would make a bruiser do 30% more damage on the actual Ice Gem part of their Great Axe. So when I mentioned on the previous one, I honorable mention there was Great Axe Ice Gauntlet. What Great Axe Ice Gauntlet used to allow you to do was you could drop a shower that was an old route, so you couldn't dodge out of it. You would get the damage bonus on top of the Ren, which used to be old Ren, which did even more damage, and then you could just go for a Great Axe Maelstrom, and then that alone, plus like one auto, would basically wipe an entire clump. So this was like a really niche build that some people played that was completely cheesy and was completely broken at the time, and it was enabled by this OG Ultimate Chill. That being said, the highlight of this is Icespike for sure. Icespike created its own meta. I think it was mostly OP because of Void Gauntlet, to be honest, and because of how old Ren's work where you couldn't dodge. So if you went for an Ultimate Chill from a Storm into a Heavy into a Spike, no one could dodge out of that. So it was a skill shot that was very easy to land. The Spike was actually a lot easier to land back in the day than it is at the current time. The game was a little bit more stable, so to speak, so you were able to consistently land this. Not, I wouldn't say in Wars it was super consistent, but there were people like Honorable Run Up Here Fate, who originally kind of made this build popular, who were dropping 40 to 60 kills every single war with this build alone, which is kind of unheard of by today's standards in terms of a single player's impact. The other thing that happened at this point that not a ton of people knew about, but the quote-unquote better companies, which to be honest at this point in the game, the better companies were the companies that could exploit better, was that you could have storms that were at different int thresholds and it would overlap. This means if someone had a 200 int storm and someone had a 201 int storm, both of them would do damage at the same time. So people would coordinate with their army. They'd have IGVGs on different thresholds of int so that they did additional damage, and they could actually stack all of the storms. They can nuke a point by just dropping Ice Shower on the point at the time, which is just really, really stupid. The other thing that this created is that sometimes it lagged and crashed people's games. So it was kind of a battle when this happened of who could actually stay alive the longest. So it kind of culminated like a bunch of Ice Gauntlet related bugs there, but in terms of like OP-ness, I would definitely say like the OG Ultimate Chill with Icespike was the most powerful form of Icespike that existed. Moving on to number 6, we have the Mortal Empowerment passive exploit with Musket. So Musket was popular during this period when it was most popular because Mortal Empower worked on top of your allies getting assists, not just yourself. So it was very easy to get to those max stacks. Those stacks would allow you to do more damage. And the thing that Matero did, and a few other people that were dropouts, which at the time, to be honest, most of us didn't know, but some people knew, and they just decided to not care about it, from what I understand at this point, was that they used the passive exploit where you can get the passives of another weapon on your current weapon. So they would just have a musket that was hitting for about 6 to 8k a shot. This is before accuracy was a thing too, so they would just be two-tapping people, and they could like one-tap people if they were coordinating it together. And that was just absurdly stupid. Carried us to one of our 3 victories, I think, of all time versus Supple, maybe around 5 at this point, but it's somewhere between 3 and 5, and that was because of this exploit, which says a lot considering that we have not won a lot versus Supple in terms of dropouts in the last year to year and a half. But yeah, moving on to number 5, we have Lifestaff Spam Crouch Bug, which allowed you to heal super, super fast for some reason. On top of windowing New World plus shaking it meant that you can never die on top of food stacking. So these are just kind of invincibility related things, but the main thing to tie in here is the Lifestaff. It enabled this to create a whole meta at one point where people were just going heavy healers. They were going heavy on every single build. Everyone was going on point. They were screen shaking the heck out of their monitor, and whoever had more people on point was just passively winning, and no one was dying. It was absurdly stupid, and it was completely broken, but that's what some people were doing at the time because there was not a lot of ethics in terms of like companies. In terms of like widespreadness, I wouldn't say this bug was like super well known by every single company, but on the select servers that did it, it was heavily exploited. It needed to be patched out very, very quickly in terms of the shaking your screen one. But the actual Lifestaff one where you're crouching in it, that was in the game for a bit longer. This basically led it to people not being able to be killed. So you could argue that this might be the most OP bug on this list, but I would consider it to be more of a cheese, which is why I haven't like put it up as high. But Lifestaff at one point in time was very, very broken. Moving on to number 4, we have the original Void Gauntlet, which allowed you to root people for seemingly infinite amounts of time because of cooldown reduction. That was absurdly stupid. You had flat stamina on the Oblivion. The Oblivion actually stripped food buffs. The Oblivion denied Sacred Grounds from actually healing people on top of all AoE heals while people were still within that Oblivion. So at the time, people would drop an Oblivion, and if you didn't leave the Oblivion aura and then come back into it, you just would not be healed by anything but except for single targets. So the meta turned into you had to have 2 single target healers in every single group, otherwise people would just completely die, and it was just absurdly stupid. Allowed Icespike to be really, really OP, and that is when I started playing Ice Gauntlet Void Gauntlet before people realized it was OP. It was like when this build came out, and I was like, oh my god, it is really stupid. But I tried to play it with Void Blade because I was edgy at the time. Moving on to number 3, we have Grav-nuke meta with Great Axe. For those of you who have played in this meta, you will know what I'm talking about, but there was situations where if you had a Great Axe perk on your weapon, for some reason Grav would go off 3 times and do flat physical damage that you couldn't ward versus. It was a very weird meta from a PvP perspective, because people would just throw a Grav out, they would Shockwave, and then they would Armor Breaker after, and then like 3 to 5 people would die. And that was it. Like, you didn't have to go for a Maelstrom, you didn't have to go for nothing. You just had to hit the grab button. And it was just absurdly stupid. Don't really know why it worked, but we have some footage of it in working at the time, and it was just absurdly stupid. And you can imagine what this felt like for point players who were trying to play on point, and then all of a sudden would just get 100 0'd by 2 Gravs that were launched from Narnia. It was really dumb. Great Axe Warhammer was probably the most OP build for a very long time, and this is one of the reasons why. Moving on to number 2, we have the Hatchet bug, which barely did not make number 1. But number 1, I think we'll get into later. But Hatchet bug, this allowed people to do about 7 to 10k per auto attack with the hatchet. And the reason why this works is because against all odds was never removed, which is like the damage. You gain damage upon like killing things if you had stuff around you. I think it was a perk that was related to that has been since kind of limited. But at the time, it was never removed. So what people would do is they would go to the boar camp, they'd fight the boars. It had unlimited amounts of stacks, and you could just get to absurd amounts of damage. And then from there, they would go queue a PvP event, and you would just do absurd amount of damage. And there was not much that could be done about it in terms of countering the build, and it would just took over the PvP meta very, very quickly. It was patched out like relatively quickly from a New World bug perspective. Like, I think this lasted about a week to 2 weeks. But that being said, it did shape an entire meta around itself, and it was absurdly stupid and resulted a lot of companies being really mad at each other. It was like, hey, if you use this bug, like, we're like not going to be cool anymore, and we're going to do weird things to you, like trying to double deck you all the time. Kind of just no one was like happy if anyone was caught using this bug, and some people were caught using it, and it was just absurdly stupid and took over OPRs and war meta alike if it was used. Moving on to number 1, the most OP bug in existence. I would say this is more of a rare one, but when mutations were first added, there was a period of time where you can get 500 of every single attribute. So you could be whatever build you wanted to be, and you could be the best tank, the best DPS, the best everything you've ever wanted to be, and you were essentially a god and unstoppable in a more legit way than some of these other cheeses. This kind of bug lasted a surprisingly long amount of time because it was a relatively rare one to get from a mutation. Still confused at this point what exactly caused it, but allowed people to, as you can imagine, just have a completely unfair advantage in every single game mode, and people that were using this bug were just straight up dominating every single game mode. Let me know if you guys think I missed any kind of really OP builds. There were some like runner-ups here that I didn't mention, like double hitting Pillar of Fire was pretty good at a certain point, but I don't think much kind of comes in the way of in terms of like how OP some of these builds were during their peak. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you in the next video.